Is the harp a hard instrument to play? Whoa. An interesting question. And I want to explore that today. In some ways, is it a useful question? Maybe not. We'll talk about that later. But an interesting question, certainly. And when we say is the harp a hard instrument to play, what exactly are we talking about? I want to break that down into three parts. Is it a hard instrument to start? Is it a hard instrument to learn once you've started and kind of get dug in? And is it a hard instrument at sort of the highest level where you're playing the hardest pieces? Is it a hard instrument? Of course it is, like any instrument is, right? So is it a hard instrument to learn? And here I would say no. I think it's a nice, easy, accessible instrument to learn. And I'm maybe biased because I started on the harp, but I think it has a certain number of advantages. One of the big advantages is fixed pitch. So assuming you've tuned the harp and you've put the levers of the pedals in the correct setting, when you play a string, it creates the sound that you want it to. You don't have to find it. So you imagine learning the violin or any string instrument having to find the pitch. Whew. Or French horn, where the way you hold your mouth, not just how you move your fingers, creates the sound that you want. It's so much easier when you're just getting started if you can, like the piano, press a key, or on the harp, play a string and get the sound you want. So fixed pitch, I think, is a really accessible bonus when you're starting. And then the sound is good right from the beginning. Again, you get down to the harp and you start playing some strings, and does it sound as good as an experienced harpist? Maybe not, but it sounds good. It sounds like a harp. It sounds pretty good. If you think about pretty much any orchestral instrument, that's not going to be the case. It can take you quite a long time just to get a halfway decent sound on a stringed instrument, or a trumpet, or an oboe, or a French horn, right? Whereas, again, with a harp or the piano, you can sit down and sound good right from the beginning. Aha! And then also, I think, physically, it's not so hard. You're sitting normally. The motion, this basic motion of just closing the fingers, pretty straightforward. The thumb, maybe a little bit trickier. But for example, again, with strings, like with violin, a bit of an awkward position with a hand, and then coordinating the bow with the bow arm with the fingers, a bit tricky. It's not that the harp is maybe easier than any other instrument, but it's certainly not hard, I think, the physical starting motion. Are there aspects that make it a bit hard to start with? Well, yes. And it's the main one is one that we'll keep coming back to, which is the fact that you're playing with both hands at the same time, that coordinating two hands. And that can be a bit tricky. Also, if you're learning to read music, you're learning to read two clefs. You're having to learn to read treble and bass clef, as opposed to many instruments where you're only reading a single clef. So a bit of extra cognitive load. But in general, I think a nice, easy, accessible instrument. I would say it's on par with the piano in terms of an easy instrument to start, and easier than a typical orchestral instrument. So that's all well and good, but how about once you start learning it? Is it an easy or hard instrument to sort of get better at? And here I would say it starts to become a bit harder. It's hard. So we still have the advantage of it being fixed pitch. That's great. It's still relatively easy to produce a good sound, but now we're starting to maybe think about and try to avoid unwanted surface noise. So try not to buzz as we place nearby a ringing string. Quite tricky. And again, now we're really starting to, as we play more complicated music, starting to feel the potential difficulty of coordinating two hands at the same time, playing multiple notes in each hand potentially at the same time, listening for maybe there's a melody in the left hand and one in the right hand, and we're trying to split our ear in two, and it's like we're playing two instruments at the same time. So that aspect is something that the harp and the piano and maybe a few other instruments share, but that with a single note instrument where you're only playing one note at a time, that can be quite a lot easier than all this coordination that's going on. again, single note instruments have their own challenges, right? But we're dealing with this challenge of coordinating two hands and playing multiple notes at the same time. And again, just kind of the physical dexterity. There's quite a bit of physical dexterity required. We also start to maybe deal with the levers or the pedals. So lever changes, having to change levers in the midst of playing, an extra load on our physical abilities and our agility, our speed. And the pedals in particular then, adding in the feet, another appendage, right? Whoa. Organ, of course, has it worse for the feet, or it's harder, I think. And maybe drum kit as well can be pretty involved for the feet. But in general, most instruments are not involving the legs and the feet. And so it's one more thing to coordinate. And again, it can get pretty demanding on the pedal harp. So these all make it so that it starts to become, like a lot of instruments, reasonably hard. And so here now I would say it's harder than the piano at this point as you're learning it, and on par maybe with a typical orchestral instrument. And how about at the highest level, the most difficult music? Is it a hard instrument? Well, yes, again, I think pretty much any instrument is. Again, if we compare it to the piano, which again is dealing with kind of the same difficulty of multiple notes, lots of notes at the same time, coordination of the two hands. What I would say is if you're playing the exact same piece on the piano or the harp, it's going to be much, much easier on the piano. Part of that is because of, with the piano, you can find and play in one motion. With a harp, you're finding and then playing. It's kind of two motions. It's just a little bit more involved. It takes more time, takes more energy to play a note, is my feeling. But that's, and of course, the pedals, right? The pedals are a big challenge. But that's counterbalanced a bit by the fact that the piano then has harder music or more notes, music with more notes than the harp does at the sort of the highest level of repertoire. So I would really hate to say that the harp is harder than the piano at the hardest repertoire, or that the piano is harder than the harp. I think again they're both super hard instruments, and other instruments like a violin as well. All that coordination, the sound, trying to get everything right in tune, crazy stuff, right? So it's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know how useful it is, but yeah, interesting thing to think about. So is this useful, right? Is this idea of thinking about the difficulty level of instruments, is that even useful? And in some ways, no, I don't think it is. But in some ways, there is potentially some use and some utility from it. I think in terms of you and as an individual making a decision about, I want to try this instrument, I want to try learning this instrument, I would say it's not so useful to think about the difficulty level of the instrument. Much more important to think, do you love the instrument? Do you love the sound of the instrument? Are you excited about trying to create that sound? Because if you love the sound, that's going to just help you learn. And if you hate the sound, I mean, that's going to make any instrument difficult. Also, everyone's reaction, everyone's experience with an instrument is going to be different. You're going to bring you different skills and different abilities. Some people sit down to an instrument and it's like they were made for it. And so you never know how you're going to experience a particular instrument, whether it's hard or easy. At the same time, if you're maybe in a school setting or some setting where you're thinking about introducing instruments to a bunch of people who maybe have no experience with playing music, then that's definitely can be worth thinking about how accessible, how easy is an instrument to start. I think harp's great for that, right? Like it sounds great, a lot of strings to tune, but it sounds great, nice accessible instrument, something that people might be really excited about learning. And then I think there is potentially maybe some psychological bonus or advantage to knowing that the harp, or at least in my opinion, that the harp is a reasonably difficult instrument to get better at, to learn and get better at. because especially the beginning is so easy and accessible, it can maybe we get a certain expectation of progress, and then as we get dug in, it's hard, right? Maybe we aren't making the type of progress we expected, and so to just bear in mind that it is, like a lot of instruments, it is difficult to get better and learn, and that maybe can be a useful thing to keep in mind as we're learning an instrument. But again, I'm kind of ambivalent in terms of, is this really a useful topic? But an interesting topic, I think, and I wanted to explore it. And I'd love to hear what you think. Did you find the harp a difficult instrument to learn? So again, I started with the harp. I found it easy, right? To me, I feel my fingers were made for the harp. I found it reasonably easy. But again, does that say anything about the inherent difficulty or not? I don't think so, right? It's more that was a very individualistic response. And so for you, what have your responses been to the harp? Do you find it difficult? Do you find it easy? That coordination of the two hands, is that a tricky thing? Is that an easy thing? And do you think it's useful to think about the difficulty level of instruments, or any instrument has its difficult parts and its easy parts, right? And maybe what we have to do is experience them to try them. If we love the sound of an instrument, try it and see, are the difficult parts easy for us? Or are the easy parts difficult for us, right? See if it's a good match for us. And I think that's probably more useful than trying to think about some, as I say, sort of objective difficulty level. But again, an interesting topic. I hope you enjoyed that. I will see you soon for another episode of Harp Tuesday. Cheers.